All right, so let's dive into something really interesting. It's 1974 at Stanford Research Institute,
SRI.
SRI, right? And we have Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, these two researchers, wanting to explore parapsychology.
Interesting area.
Oh, for sure. Now, imagine the SRI vice president walking into Jacques Valle's office, shutting the door, and you can almost hear that heavy thud.
Oh, yeah.
He's worried. He's got these major contracts, think Xerox, IBM, AT&T, Bank of America, big money. And he's thinking all this could be at risk if they're associated with, psychic research.
Yeah, I can see that.
But Valet, he doesn't back down. He argues that SRI's whole purpose is to take on those high-risk research projects that nobody else will touch, to explore the unknown. Even, something like parapsychology. What a start, right?
Right off the bat, it kind of highlights this clash, doesn't it? You have this very practical corporate world and then this pull towards something that totally defies what we think we know. It seems like that fear of, well, reputational damage, it's a big obstacle when you're looking into these unusual phenomena.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving into today. Our listeners, they're like you. They want to understand these strange phenomena, but they don't want to get lost in a bunch of theories and speculation.
We want the real deal.
Right, the real deal, those aha moments, those surprising facts, without feeling overwhelmed.
So for this deep dive, we're focusing on this amazing conversation with Jacques Valle on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Now, Valet, he's got this really unique perspective, right? He's a scientist, he's got a background in computer science, astronomy, and he's dedicated so much of his career to studying UFOs and other things that, well, they're not exactly mainstream science.
Exactly. He's been at it for decades, bringing that scientific mindset to these really unconventional subjects.
Uh-huh.
And in this conversation, he shares some incredible stories and insights. We're talking about the early days of parapsychology research at SRI, those remote viewing experiments.
Spooky stuff. Yeah, historical accounts of strange things in the sky going back centuries.
Yeah.
Analysis of some really weird materials. He touches on everything from advanced technology to the possibility of, well, something completely different.
And that's the challenge, right? We have all this information, so much to cover. How do we pull out the most important and thought-provoking parts? That's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to break down this massive conversation, give you a clear understanding of these complex topics, and make sure you're both informed and entertained.
Sounds good. So let's go back to SRI. Now, Valet wasn't just there when Puthoff and Targ showed up. He was already working there in '74 on ARPANET.
The precursor to the internet.
Exactly, the precursor to the internet. Then comes this proposal for parapsychology research. Initially, they focused on things like psychokinesis.
Moving things with your mind.
Yeah, moving things with your mind. Psychic communication, trying to figure out what's inside sealed envelopes. The classic parapsychology experiments.
The foundation.
The foundation, exactly. But Valet, he wasn't just thinking about the psychology. He was asking, where's the physics? What are the underlying principles?
The scientist in him.
Exactly. He recognized that if these things are real, it might mean there are big holes in our understanding of the universe. He even mentioned those conflicts between relativity and quantum mechanics.
The big ones.
The big ones, right? Maybe that's where these new forces or senses are operating. And then there's this research he mentions, pretty recent stuff from 2019 and even more recent, suggesting that humans might actually be able to sense magnetic fields like migratory animals.
Wow, that's interesting.
It is. Think about it. Maybe we have senses that we're not even aware of playing a role in all this.
And that ties in perfectly to the discussion about indigenous knowledge, right? Valet talks about the Pacific Islanders, those incredible navigators. They could find their way across vast oceans, and it wasn't just about the stars and the moon.
Right, there was something more. He mentions these gifted individuals on their ships, people who just inherently knew the right direction.
Like an intuition.
Exactly, like an intuition, an innate sense. And maybe, just maybe, those are senses that have become dormant in our more technologically driven societies. And then you have the telepathy tapes, this podcast focusing on nonverbal autistic children who seem to have these incredible abilities, identifying objects they can't see, colors, numbers, even sequences. And Valle mentions that companies in Silicon Valley are actually recruiting people with these talents.
Silicon Valley, always on the cutting edge.
Always on the cutting edge, right? What if these abilities are more common than we think, but we've kind of lost touch with them?
Fascinating thought.
It is. Okay, so let's move on to the remote viewing experiments at SRI with Ingo Swann. Now, Valle got involved because of his technical background, his interest in the subject, but the context here is so important. The intelligence agencies, those three-letter agencies, were funding SRI to explore the military uses of psychic abilities.
Wow, serious stuff.
Serious stuff, right? They were thinking about things like remotely viewing Soviet developments, finding lost spacecraft. They wanted to see if these abilities could give them an edge.
Strategic advantage.
Strategic advantage, absolutely. And Saran, he wasn't just thinking about the military. He wanted to apply these principles to science and technology in general. And Valle's big contribution was coming up with a way to coordinate the remote viewing process. He drew inspiration from computer data, addressing, thinking about direct access, indirect referencing, accessing external data.
So he applied computer science to ESP.
Exactly. He used longitude and latitude as a sort of address for remote viewing targets. It provided a structure, a framework for these experiments.
Brilliant.
It was. So the way it worked, the viewer would be in a quiet room, just paper and pencil. They'd get the coordinates of a target, and then they would create an ideogram, basically a scribble, to represent their initial impression. The key was to focus on that first signal, not to overthink it or try to name it right away.
So like a gut feeling.
Yeah, a gut feeling, a pure perception. And Valle describes this concept of an overwhelming signal that experienced viewers learn to handle. It's like the information is always there, but most of us don't know how to filter it, to decode it. And that's where the ideogram comes in.
It captures that raw perception.
Exactly. And Valle actually shares a personal experience. He was doing a remote viewing session, and the target was this peak in the Andes Mountains. And he physically felt cold, dizzy, even afraid of falling.
Whoa, that's intense.
And you know what? Those sensations perfectly matched the real conditions at that peak.
No way.
It's true. Pretty amazing, right?
So he was feeling what was actually there.
It seems that way. Of course, Valle points out that remote viewing wasn't always perfect. Errors did happen. But some individuals, like Joe McMonigal, were remarkably accurate. He even described a hidden Soviet super submarine, something the U.S. Navy initially didn't believe.
They probably thought he was making it up.
Right? But there it was. And they even developed ways to try to quantify the accuracy of these perceptions. After Valle had that successful hit with the Andes Peak, Ingo Swann actually sent him home. He wanted Valle to hold on to that feeling of direct access, that bypass of the analytical mind.
He didn't want him to overthink it.
Exactly. So all this sounds like science fiction, but apparently it was really happening. And this belief in these abilities, it's not new. Valle points out that it goes way back. Seers, prophets, the Oracle of Delphi, even someone like Hitler reportedly believed in these things and maybe tried to use them.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme throughout history, isn't it?
It is. But the challenge has always been separating the real deal from the fakes, the charlatans.
Absolutely.
But then Valle brings up something interesting. Historical artifacts that seem to show disc-shaped objects in the sky. He mentions this token found in Burgundy, France. It clearly shows a disc hovering, deflecting arrows. You could interpret it as a shield, but the way it's depicted, it's definitely airborne, disc-shaped. Makes you think, right?
Definitely makes you think.
And he mentions the ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vimanas, these flying machines. So you have these reports throughout history. Even though they were often suppressed or explained away through religious interpretations, seems like people have been seeing strange things in the sky for a long time.
And that suppression is important, right? It shows how societal beliefs can shape how we see these things, how we interpret them. It's like the modern-day stigma around UFO sightings, the fear of speaking out.
Absolutely. And then there are those old paintings that seem to show craft-like objects. Art historians often interpret them as religious symbols, but Valle points out that some of them have these mechanical details, and there's sometimes a big time gap between the painting and any possible original accounts.
So hard to say for sure.
Hard to say for sure, right? Okay, so fast forward to more modern times. Valle notices that accounts of unusual objects in the sky, they've been pretty consistent from the 1700s to now. Obviously, as technology advances, you have more hoaxes, people seeking attention, but that core consistency is still there.
It's like a pattern.
It's a pattern. And it's not just anecdotes. Valle talks about the French government's official UFO project. They can explain most sightings, around 95%, but there's this 5% that remains a mystery. And some of these cases from decades ago sound a lot like the recent Tic Tac sightings.
The ones the Navy pilot saw.
Exactly. There was even a case in the 1950s where a French Air Force jet chased an object that shot up to the top of the atmosphere incredibly fast, way beyond anything we could do back then.
So they're seeing things that defy our understanding of technology, even from way back.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the analysis of strange materials. Valle describes this case from 1977 in Iowa. It's winter, freezing cold, and this glowing mass of liquid steel falls into a park.
Liquid steel just falling from the sky.
Yeah, pretty weird, right? People collect samples, and they find it's chromium, titanium, iron, but not typical industrial steel. The local steel company says it wasn't theirs. The Strategic Air Command denies any involvement. But here's the kicker. They do isotope analysis at Stanford with Dr. Gary Nolan, and they find no evidence of artificial manipulation.
So not a hoax.
At least not in that way.
That's huge.
It is. And this research was published in Progress in Aerospace Science, a peer-reviewed journal. So it establishes a scientific method for analyzing these materials. Valle also mentions Professor Sturck's work at Stanford on other alleged UFO materials, including a case from Brazil with strange isotope ratios, which Dr. Nolan is now looking into.
So the science is catching up, slowly but surely.
It seems that way. But it's important to remember that not all strange sightings mean aliens. Valle talks about electronic warfare, radar deception technology. There's this thing called DSPR, which can basically mess with radar signals, making things look different or even disappear.
Creating illusions.
Exactly, illusions on radar. This could explain some of those seemingly impossible movements, those sudden disappearances. It could even explain those reports of signals being blocked, like in the Tic Tac incident. And Valle mentions that China has developed these gadgets that can make small drones look like giant objects on radar. Stealth technology is getting super advanced.
So it's getting harder to tell what's real and what's not.
It is. He even tells this story about a colleague in the Army who participated in missions where they disguised regular aircraft with lights to look like UFOs. They were testing security responses at sensitive sites.
Wow, that's sneaky.
Pretty sneaky, right?
Yeah.
So while this technology can explain some sightings, it probably doesn't explain everything, especially those cases where people see something really strange, something that doesn't fit our current understanding of physics.
Right. Things that just shouldn't be able to fly that way.
Exactly. And speaking of seeing things, Valle shares his own personal sighting. He was 15 in France, and he saw this disc-shaped object with a clear dome hovering over a cathedral.
Classic UFO shape.
Classic UFO shape, right?
Yeah.
And his friends saw it too through binoculars, and they both drew the same thing. It was silent, just hovering there.
Creepy.
And later, while working at the Paris Observatory tracking satellites, he came across all these reports of unexplained sightings that were investigated but not publicized.
Hidden from the public.
Hidden from the public. And he says that his own sighting when he was a teenager, that's what sparked his lifelong interest in all this.
A defining moment.
It was. He also talks about the problem of disclosure, how hard it is for people to come forward, especially credible people like executives, scientists.
They're afraid of being ridiculed.
Absolutely, afraid of ruining their careers. And then he tells this story about a CEO who saw this huge, slow-moving object that just faded away in the clear sky, like it dissolved.
Just vanished.
Just vanished. This reminded Valle of his own ideas about interdimensional travel, shifts in reality.
It's like something out of a movie.
It is, right?
Right.
And it makes you think, what if our understanding of propulsion, of the environment these things operate in, is totally wrong? What if there are other dimensions, other universes, where distance and time work differently?
It challenges everything we think we know.
It does. And here's the big question. Why have these objects, or whatever they are, remained basically the same throughout history, even as our technology has advanced so much? Either their technology is incredibly stagnant, or, as Valle suggests, it's something else entirely.
Something we can't even comprehend.
That's something we can't even comprehend, right? Now, on a more personal note, Valle talks about trying to recreate those parapsychological conditions in his own home. He had an out-of-body experience, encountered this massive rectangular mass entity.
Sounds scary.
He was terrified, but not because of the entity itself. It was the feeling of being outside his body, that disorientation.
I can imagine.
And he mentions Federico Fagan, the guy who invented the integrated circuit, who apparently also experienced out-of-body travel and got insights from it.
Wow, so even brilliant minds are having these experiences.
It seems so. And then there's the story of Valle's first wife. She saw this silent, moving mass of blue-white light at their home in the redwood forest. No shape, but it seemed to be interacting with things around their house. That's very strange. And he mentions the ball of light at Skinwalker Ranch, entering a home, seeming to have some awareness. And Robert Bigelow's experiments at the ranch with lights and objects in enclosed spaces.
Skinwalker Ranch. Always something weird happening there.
It seems that way. So what are the big takeaways here? The surprising research into parapsychology and remote viewing, those consistent reports of strange things in the sky throughout history, the analysis of those weird materials, the possibility of advanced deception technology, and those personal experiences that really make you think.
A lot to
It's
digest.
a lot to digest, right? But
Yes.
that's what we wanted to do, give you those surprising facts, those insights, without overloading you.
And it all goes back to that initial hesitation at SRI, doesn't it? The clash between established science and the desire to explore the unknown. But the evidence, from history, from scientific analysis, from personal accounts, it all suggests that there's so much more out there than we currently understand.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. If these things have remained pretty much the same for centuries, if our current science can't fully explain them, what fundamental assumptions do we need to reevaluate? What if our ideas about reality, about consciousness, about the universe are just plain wrong?
Big questions.
Big questions.
Right.
We encourage you to explore this further on your own. Check out Valle's books like Forbidden Science Volume 6 and Scattered Castles. Listen to the Telepathy Tapes podcast. Dive into the research on those strange materials. This is just the beginning.
The beginning of a long journey.
Exactly. To really be well-informed about this stuff, you need an open mind, you need to consider different perspectives, and you need to think critically.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unknown. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep that curiosity alive.